Hi, this is a really important day in this course because this will be our first example of connecting a database to our web pages. And I'm going to talk about the assignment at the end of class. But what I'm going to do, part of the assignment is to run through this tutorial. I want to make sure you get it right. So you're going to do this tutorial, then you're going to add a little bit to it. So before we start, I want to talk about connecting databases to our code and the approach we're going to take. In the old days, there was a database server. You connected to a database. And our app running on the web server, if it wanted to access data, it would send a string over here that contained a SQL statement. And it would get back data in some form or another. Depending on specifics, you could get data in different forms. Okay, so what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is the use of a string. Because what can you put in a string? You can put any characters, right? So we could put, if we wanted to pull everything from the customer table, maybe the correct statement would be select star from customer. But if I had a bad day typing, I could just as well put in the string select star from customer, forget the C. And guess what? The web server's code would still compile because we're forming a string just like we're supposed to. The problem is when the database went and accessed it, there's no customer table, so it would blow up and give us an error. Now, that's a very obvious example. If we had an example like that, if all the problems were like that, then you could tell the first time that you ran it that there was a problem. But sometimes the errors would be more insidious and would be at levels that you would not always hit. If you had, for example, a search function on your website and you were able to put a mix of criteria, maybe the programmer spelled one of the criteria wrong, and you could test it and you might never test that criteria or a combination of criteria, and your program would blow up, and that's not good. Remember, runtime errors are bad. Compile errors are good, all right? So feel good about yourself the next time you write a program and you have a million compile errors, because those are the kinds of errors you want. Why are those the kind of errors you can want? Because it keeps you from running the program and it tells you that there is an error, and you have to fix those errors before you can run your program. A runtime error is where there's some specific conditions at runtime that generate an error. And this model was prone to having runtime errors because we were simply sending a string to the database. And as we know, we could put anything in the string. It doesn't have to be a valid SQL statement. It doesn't have to be a valid table, column, whatever. So what do we do instead in .NET now? We have what's called the entity framework. Let me start with a brand new blank slate. Entity framework. And what does that mean? It means on the web server, there's a collection of classes for the different entities in the application. Now, these classes would correspond more or less to tables. All right, not a one-to-one relationship necessarily, but they would more or less represent tables. And these tables correspond and are in sync with the tables in the database. So if you have a customer table in the database that has a customer ID, first name, last name, email address, there would be a class called customer in the ASP.NET app that would also be called customer and would have a customer ID, first name, last name, and email address. What's so good about that? Well, the web server, when it calls, these calls are made through these classes. It's kind of hard to diagram that, but the classes that are running in the web server, they make the calls to the database. Now, because they're objects, if we get something wrong with the table name, we get a compile error. If we try to access the customer table, we have the same typo that we had in the previous example. There's no customer class, and therefore we get a compile error. Likewise, if we get the name of a column wrong, or if we get a name of a table wrong, column wrong, anything like that. And therefore, all the calls to the database are made through these classes. And all the data from the database is put in these classes. So I didn't talk about getting the data back from the database in the previous example, but there were similar problems in that too. Similar problems to the retrieve problems. So this is a nice way to do this of making our code tighter and catching errors at compile time rather than runtime, which is always going to be our goal. All right. And ensuring these types, as opposed to just using a simple string for a SQL command, using these types ensures that if we do something wrong, that the compiler is most likely going to catch it. All right, now where's the problem? Well, there isn't a problem really, but in order to make this work, these things have to be in sync. Therefore, we wouldn't want to have to make these or make these and make these, because we could make them different. So if we made our classes, made our database, if we weren't really careful, we could make them slightly different. We could put an extra column in one of the customer tables that was not available in the other, on the database or in the class. So, programmers despise having to do something more than once for good reason, right? And the good reason is because they can be inconsistent. They can be out of sync. So with the entity framework, we have two choices. We could build the database and create the classes from what's in the database, or we could build the classes and create the database from what we've built in the classes. That way, in theory, those two things will always be in sync. So we build our classes initially, and we create all our entities in here. All right. We then run code that goes and updates the database to create those entities. Later on, we need to change something. We need to either change a column name or expand a column or add a new table or whatever, we make those changes to the classes and then resync up the database. So we'll see that in today's example where we sync that up. Now, one thing I didn't go over about the entity framework is it allows a neat little handling of related data as well. Sort of file that away in the back of your brain, and later on in the semester, we'll come to do that. All right, so without further ado, let's go and do this tutorial. I'm going to go and run this tutorial, and I'm going to follow it step by step. At the end, you're going to get a code that looks like this. List of movies, a link to create a new movie, a link to edit a movie, a link to view the details of a movie, a link to delete the movie, and finally a link to, or not a link, but a text box to search it. So nice little mini application for movies. So first step, we're going to create a Razor Page app. We've done that before. So let's go and do that. And we're going to call it, we're going to try to keep everything identical. That will cause less potential problems. So we're going to call up Visual Studio. This up here. New project. We want a ASP.NET Core web app. So it's the one that uses Razor Page. So we click that, click next. We put our name here. And again, please name them correctly. This one is Razor Pages Movie. And don't give me something that's called like Web Application 1. That's so disheartening when I see that. And later on, when you are doing this professionally, you're going to have any number of applications that you worked on, and it would be tough to like, what was Web Application 37 again for? Just don't. Razor Pages Movie. I can put it wherever I want. For simplicity, I'm going to put it on my desktop. Place the solution and project in the same directory. Sure thing. Framework, we're going to use .NET 6.0. Authentication type, that is, will we have a login feature within our application? In this particular one, no, we're not. That's going to come later down the line. Can configure for HTTPS, certainly. And create. And we're off. And it generates all these files like we've seen before. We run this, we get our nice little and we get this error again. I don't know how this is set up to allow this, but we will correct it by doing this. Should remember to do that before class started, but this is useful in case you run into this on your machine. Chrome flags. And what we're going to say is down here somewhere. Hope I did not pass it. Well, I want, I'm going to use my head here. And find on this page localhost. Allow invalid certificates from localhosts. I will allow that. And now, I think I have to restart the browser. There we go. There's our page, the home page, privacy page, and so on. All right, let's pull back up the tutorial. That's not what I wanted. Never quite sure why the link goes away if you're already logged in to Canvas. That doesn't sound right to me, but what do I know? All right, let's go back in the tutorial. So we've done step 1. Let's look at what step 2 is. And for this, I'm going to do a lot of copying and pasting because I type very slowly and no one wants to watch me type. So we create our Razor Page app. We've done that. Run the app. We've done that. Examine the project files. Take the time to do this. We've sort of already done this in class. But this will be a good time to review this. Our next step, add a model. This is one thing that is a little confusing in this, is we call both the code that exists in a pair with the Razor page the model for the page, and we call this the data model. So we use the model both ways. So there's like a page model and a data model. I wish they called those page controllers, because that's really what they are. They actually serve the role of a controller. But we're stuck with it. I can't make up my own names for stuff, unfortunately. So just keep that in mind. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a folder for models. So I'm going to right mouse on this, add folder. I'm going to call that models. All right. Right click and say add class. So what we're doing now in our diagram is we're adding those entities, we're adding those classes that relate to the entities in our application. These will eventually be used to generate our database. So right mouse here, add new item, class. We're going to follow along with what they do. Name the class movie. Generally speaking, you use the singular when you're naming the class. So movie. And that makes sense because this class is going to contain the code for a movie class. It's going to contain the attributes that a single movie has. What does a movie have? It has a name, a title, maybe an ID, and so on. So I go and add that. There it is. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to copy and paste the code in from the website. So I copy it and paste it. Using system component model data annotations allow us to do these kinds of things. We can put what are called annotations on our field to give restrictions. Here, for example, even though this is a date time field for the release date of the movie, we only want the date part of it. So that's what that annotation defines, that we're only interested in the date part of that. So these define properties for this class. Remember, class versus object. A class is code that represents members of the entity. An object is a specific instance of that entity. So Star Wars would be an object. A class would be movie. Now, you've all had C#. I don't know how much detail they go into, but essentially, these are properties of this class. It's just that the get and set method, like we do in Java, those of you that happen to be taking Java, I don't know if anyone is, or those that have taken Java before, we would have to write a get and a set method. Here you can sort of just put this in, and that takes the place of a get and set method. And that allows us to treat it just like it was a variable. If you didn't understand that, don't worry about it. This is how you declare a property on an object. Okay, it's going to save everything. Next step. Scaffold the movie model. Now you're going to love this, all right? I like anything that does some work for me, right? Even if something only does part of the work that I have to do. That's great, because then I don't have to do all the work, right? I have, assignments I have to grade, right? If someone graded half the assignments for me, I wouldn't complain that I have to grade the other half, all right? I would be happy that at least part of my job was done. So what we're going to do is we're going to scaffold this. Now, you think of what a scaffold is. A scaffold is a structure that you use to build upon things. Like, for example, if you're doing construction on a building, you might have a scaffold around it so that you can access parts of it and build upon it and so on. All right. By scaffolding, that means we're going to create pages, simple, bare bones pages for the CRUD functionality, CRUD operations. CRUD is unfortunately named. That doesn't sound very cool, but CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. The other thing that it does is it provides a list of all of them. So I don't know why they didn't include that. Maybe that's caught up in the read part of it. So create is to add something to the database. And I'm using database, but we're adding something to the entity through the entity framework classes. Read means simply to access it. Update means to change something. Delete means, of course, to delete it. So I'm going to go up here, and you probably don't need to do this. If you do, here's the instructions for it. But I'm going to create the Pages movie folder. So generally speaking, for each entity, we're going to have a folder in Pages. So I'm going to add new folder. This I'm going to call Movies, plural. A bug or maybe a feature of this previously is if you give your folder the same name as your class, as your model, you run into problems. That's why the folders for within the Pages I call them with the plural. So models or movies. And the model I create with the singular. So movie in the models folder. Movie, movies. So I click on that. I right mouse on it. And I say add new scaffolded item. We want Razor Pages using Entity Framework. The scaffolding works for a lot of different stuff, but we're going to primarily be using this to generate our Razor Pages with Entity Framework CRUD. Click our add. All right, here we supply some data. All right, what model are we doing this for? Well, that's pretty easy. We only have one model, right? The movie. The database context class. I can click on that to add, and it will add a context using this naming convention. In other words, the name of the application context. Now, what does a data context mean? That essentially means a database that we're storing our stuff in. You could possibly have more than one database if you wanted to. So you could have more than one context if you wanted to. All right. For most of the stuff we're doing, we're going to have a single context until we get into the authentication. Then we might have more than one context. But effectively, think of this as like, this is the collection of all the entities, in other words, the database. And I click add. Then I let Visual Studio do its magic. I'll have a sip of my coffee. It installs some stuff. I think it installs stuff that you need without you having to go in and install it now. Does a bunch of stuff. And when we're done, we have in our movies folder, in our Pages movies folder, we have 5 Razor Pages. Index is a listing of all the movies in the database, or all the movie entities. Create allows us to add a new one. Details allows us to view the information without being able to change it. Edit allows us to view the information and change it. Finally, delete allows us to delete stuff from the database. Now, what I want to say here. Slipped my mind. We have one more step to do, though. We have to in sync, we have to synchronize our database context, that is the database. We have to sync our database with our models. So how do we do that? That's the next step of the process. We'll wait until I do this to actually look at the code. So I'm going to go up to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, Package Manager Console. That is sort of a command line that is used in this case to synchronize our database with our model. So we look at this, what do we type in? And I never remember from semester to semester. We first add a migration. What is a migration? A migration is an update to the database. So for example, if we created our database, which we're about to do in a minute here, and we're working on this project, and I come back, a week from now, and someone tells me there needs to be another table in our database. So I go and create the model for it. I'm going to create a new migration for that update. So I create my initial migration to initialize those tables. Any change to the database, though, any change to the models that I make has to be synced up with the database, and therefore I would create a new migration. What you can do with that actually is if there proved to be a problem, like let's say I added the table wrong, I did something and my boss comes along and says, no, that's not right. You need to do such and such. Then I can roll back the migration and get back to the previous state of the database. Initial create can be any name that I want to give it. Initial create is a good name because that specifies what you're doing. That's the very first time and you're creating the database. Add migration has to be typed in like this, although I don't believe it's case sensitive. So you could type in add dash migration with lowercase letters. So I do that. It does its thing. It succeeded. It gives you a warning, but we don't have to worry about that. Let's not worry about that right now. If there was a more serious problem, it would give us an error that we would have to fix. And again, to undo this, we use remove migration. That will roll it back. So that just, to create a migration is to create a set of updates that you're going to do to the database. All right. So now if we actually look, we can see that in migrations. Here's the code to create that movie table. All right. So it gets creative migration, gets the code to do the update to the database ready, but it doesn't apply the code. To apply the code, we do update dash database. I can do lowercase and it should work. And it shows us what it's doing. I didn't get any errors. I probably got the same warning that I did before. Yeah, I did. But now in the database, there is a database for this. I can see that database if I want to. Go under View, go to SQL Server Object Explorer. And I can see for this project, oh no, never mind. Mistaken. Under this, local DB, right. Under databases, there's our database. And we can go in and view it if we want to. See the table that has It's a table for movie. What does a movie have? For columns. Has an ID, title, release date, genre, price. Guess what? Where have we seen that before? We've seen that in the model. ID, title, release date, genre, and price. Now, it's okay to look at the database to debug, but you never want to make changes, never's a long time. So let me rephrase that. You don't typically make changes directly to the database. You go through the model. So if I realize that I forgot a column for, director, for example, I should go and update the model, add that column, create a new migration for it, and then update the database. And that should add to that table the director. All right. So far, so good. Now we can run it. Almost. We have to add to the layout a link to this. And our link is going to be to the index page. All the other pages you can access through the index page. So I'm going to go here. Copy that. I want to go to movies, so I will change this to movies/index. In other words, the index page within the movies folder. Somewhere in one of these control files, there's mapping that says this URL gets sent to this page. Is that NAP settings? No. Is that in program CS? No. Use routing is probably sets that up and does the mapping for it, I would guess. All right. So now, drum roll, please. Run this. Click on movies. We get a blank page, which, of course, because we don't have any data entered yet. So let's go and enter a few things. Star Wars, which was released sometime in July of 1976, if I'm not mistaken. Sci-fi. Really, sci-fi or genre should be a separate table, but we're not ready to talk about multi-tables yet, so we'll let them slide on that. Price $20. Click create. Adds that to the database. We can edit it. We can view it. Why do I need to view even when I have the edit? Well, some people might not be allowed to edit, but some people might be allowed to view the data. When we talk about authentication, we'll talk about how you can make it so that you have to be a valid user to edit the data, but anyone can go and view the details for it. Finally, we can delete it, which I will not do. Just trust me. There is the, oh, okay, I lied, I did it. I couldn't resist it. We'll put it back in. Each time I increase the price. And there you go. We add another one. Not sure when that was released. We'll guess at 1978. Genre also sci-fi, price $30, create, and now both of them are there. All right. There's further instructions in here. And it tells you to look at some things before we get into the further instructions. So look at it. And look at these things, what it's doing, just to get a sense of a background of stuff. We'll look at these pages next class in more detail. But as a preview, read through them. You'll see a common theme with what we've covered so far in this class, in that the .cs file for each of these pages, let's look at the index page, fills up data, and the Razor page itself accesses data from the model. But we'll go into this in more detail, but I just want to show that it fits exactly what we've been doing all along. We updated layout already. We haven't looked at the create model. We'll look at these pages next week. They're showing you the database like I showed you a minute ago. They talk about seeding the database. Seeding the database is to put some code in there so that if the database doesn't exist, it creates it with records already. So it pre-populates the database. So in my case, I started with an empty database. If you seed the data, then when you go in, it will have data already in it. I want you to try this. If you have trouble with it, don't worry about seeding the database. That being said, give it a try at least. All right. But, you know, I've had students get hung up on this and spend a lot of time when there was a small problem. And this is the less critical part of the assignment. This shows how to, not sure what. Just read through this. There's one more thing that you have to do. Add a search functionality. And this will walk you through that. I'm running out of time here, so I won't cover this, but this will talk about how to allow a search. As you might imagine, you're going to need to change the Razor page itself, the CS/HTML file, to add the text box and the button. Then you're going to need to change the code behind CS file to use the data from the form to perform a query that isn't every movie in the table, but only the movies that match the query. Now, in addition to this, I want you to add another table, and you don't need to worry about making the tables related. We'll talk about related tables a little later on. All right, we're only interested in doing tables individually right now. So you're going to need to add an actors table. And we can, yeah, and try this activity a few times. You want to get this down where you can do it in your sleep. By the end of the semester, I have it down where I can do it in my sleep. With the first time I do it every semester, I'm afraid I'll forget something small. That's why I follow the tutorial. But now that I've gone through it, it has sparked my memory, and I'm sure I'll be able to do it relatively easy. You'll also need to add a actor table containing actor ID, last name, first name, and birth date. Use the same DB context as you did for movies. In other words, when you scaffold the actors, for movies, we didn't have one before, so we had to create a new context. Here, we're going to use the same context that we had before. And then you'll have, and then you're going to need to create a new migration. And then you're going to need to update the database again, and then your actors table should be there and available. All right, there's a lot of material, and it's important material. I would suggest going over and reviewing the tutorial a couple times. Well, you obviously have to do it one time to do your assignment, but do it a couple times to make sure you have the process down and you understand it. And make sure you understand what's going on at each step. Maybe not like every minute detail, but in general, what's happening? What does it mean when we create a migration? What does it mean when we update the database? What does it mean when we scaffold? And so on. Are there any questions at this point? I got one note. Anyone else have a question? All right, that's all I had today. If you wish, I'll see you in lab. If not, we'll see you next week. So have a good week and talk to you later.